Three weeks ago, a great friend of mine with whom I lived in Hackney in East London during my internship at UBS 17 years ago sent me a message. And the message simply said, TJ has a court date next week. If there's anything you feel you can say to assist him on his journey at this stage, he would really appreciate guidance from those who have negotiated the harder sides of life. And I was like, well, what's the story? What is it that he needs help with? And he was like, well, he's been charged with possession of drugs with intent to supply, and his sentencing hearing is in 2 weeks, and his lawyer says he's going to get 4 years. But this is a brilliant kid. He made a silly mistake. He was trying to make some money to help his mom, and we need to help him. And you've had all this experience. Can you talk to him? Can you, help him understand what's going on, especially because his lawyer is not very good, and ultimately his lawyer is kind of just going through the process. So this began this kind of 2-week-long conversation with this young 22-year-old kid from Hackney. And it was amazing talking to him, because it reminded me of the day I got arrested and in 2011, and having no idea what was about to happen. Sitting in a room with a bunch of people that I didn't know, that I didn't identify with, even though I'd grown up in the UK for 26 years, I just felt very vulnerable, because I understood that I'd walked into a storm, but I had no idea what the storm was going to look like. So I talked to TJ, and we prepared for this hearing that he was about to have. Now, when Oliver said, the harder side of life, what he meant was this 7 years where my life was basically a series of deeply negative headlines. And by the way, I just got to say, on this platform, we've heard some amazing people speak, so it's kind of weird bringing down the tone, looking backwards when everyone in this room, like the whole of Ghana, the whole of Africa, in contradiction to the West, is looking forward. But, bear with me, in the end of this story, we do look forward. Now, I met a lot of brilliant young black men in prison. They'd come from underprivileged backgrounds and really didn't have much of an option other than to resort to dealing drugs to make life work. These are young men who are now caught in an inescapable cycle of criminalization by a system incapable of recognizing or acknowledging that young black men are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice systems of the Western world. Whether you're in the UK or in the US, my reference is the UK, but we are disproportionately represented. And there's a reason for that, and I don't really need to talk about it, you know. It's a system that refuses to acknowledge the obvious reality that, crime is a function of a lack of opportunities for development and growth. In the UK, despite being only 15% of the UK population, BAME offenders represent 25% of the prison population, a full 53% of the young offenders population. Can you imagine? More than half of all kids in prison in the UK are black kids, but they're not half of the community. For 7 years, my life was a series of headlines, and just a few of them, going from being arrested to the realization by the system that I was actually Ghanaian, and therefore, by the way, I'm speaking as if I knew this at the time, I didn't. The realization of the system that because I was Ghanaian, they could label me as a foreign national, and that they could use me later on for the immigration policies, which we'll come to. The question is, how did I become a pin-up for all that was evil in the UK finance industry? How did I become labeled foreign national offender number 1 in the whole country, and told by no less than the UK Prime Minister that my deportation from the UK was necessary to protect the health and morals of the country, because apparently I was an immigrant who had, despite growing up in the UK from childhood, abused the hospitality of the country. How was it that it was necessary that I should be escorted by a guard of 5 people and carried up the back steps of a Kenyan Airways flight to be flown 5,000 kilometers around the world, away from my friends and family who I'd grown up with since childhood? Well, on the 14th of September 2011, I wrote an email. And the email basically, in the email I took responsibility for a $2.3 billion loss on my $50 billion trading book at UBS Investment Bank. The reason I took responsibility was because basically nobody else wanted to. And I felt that I had been taught that as someone who takes a leadership role, someone who benefits from being in a responsible position, that when things go wrong, you have to take responsibility for it. You know, I was taught, I was the firstborn son of a Ghanaian United Nations official growing up in Israel and Syria. And to resolve conflicts, someone has to be responsible for everyone's welfare when things go wrong. You know, my school was this great Quaker school that had the motto, non sibi sed omnibus, not for self but for all, which actually reflects Ghanaian values too, and general African values, which is that you belong to a community, right? And you honor that community by making your contributions to the community. That includes when things go wrong. So I sent this email taking full responsibility and isolating responsibility to myself. Gabrielle Union said the other day that black people need to stop putting themselves in the position where they sacrifice themselves for the benefit of the majority white community. And I made that mistake. Well, it wasn't a mistake, right? Because the journey I've been on since then has been the most enlightening, the most enriching. And I've grown as an individual as a result of it, but only because I took responsibility. I was head boy at school because I lived those values. At university, I spent my whole time working at the Students' Union trying to improve my university community. Those were my values. So it became really weird when suddenly I realized that the portrayal of me in the media, I was in prison, they'd put me in prison, they wouldn't give me bail, they said I was a flight risk, that I would run away to Ghana, even though I lived in the UK for 26 years and I had written the email. So it was very odd. I found it very strange when I was suddenly basically being painted as this really evil person, and I didn't know what to do about that, right? So I was given a choice. The choice I was given was plead guilty and you'll get a shorter sentence. And I said, well, if I plead guilty, will you give me the disclosure I need to be able to tell the story of what really happened? Because you can tell this narrative of me, but one day I want to help people understand what happened so that it doesn't happen again. They told me that I couldn't plead not guilty. I had to plead guilty and I wouldn't get this information, and that the only way I could get the information was if I pled not guilty, in which case I would get a swinging prison sentence. And so, given that choice, my friends and I, really wonderful, amazing people, my friends, we had a conversation, and the conversation basically, through it, we decided that the only thing we could do was plead not guilty, because it was more valuable to be able to tell this story than to come home soon, right? This long-term thinking that we're supposed to be able to engage in. But it does make life more difficult in the short term. But the riches that come at the end of it are incredible. Now, what's odd about this story is that I wasn't convicted for acting in pursuit of my own gain. I mean, I was acquitted of the charges related to personal gain. And we know that because the jury came back and asked the judge while they were deliberating, can we find him guilty if we don't think he was intending to make a gain for himself, but he was intending to make a gain for the bank? And the judge said, well, you have to find him not guilty of the 4 charges of false accounting if you don't think he intended to make a gain for himself. But if you want to find him guilty of something, then you can find them guilty of the 2 charges of fraud, because there doesn't need to be an intent to make a gain from it. And so they came back and found me guilty of 2 of the 6 charges I faced. Now, what's interesting about this is that I have the sense that, or rather the sense that's given of me is that I was a criminal mastermind fraudster. So this label was the opening line of the prosecutor. It's, funnily enough, was a label that came back at the end of the process when they were finally finding a way to deport me. So it's like, it wasn't their first time at the rodeo. They knew where they were going, and there was a plan the whole time. Because whilst I was in prison, immigration law was edited to make it, well, basically it made it impossible for me to not be deported. I fought it anyway. But it's funny, when I was sitting on the plane in between all these 5 people at the back, and I remembered a conversation I had with the deputy governor of Maidstone Prison, Penny Bartlett. And she said to me, "Kwek, do you really think you're going to avoid being deported?" I was chairman of the prison council, and we're just having a chat afterwards. "Do you really think you're going to not get deported?" I guess she knew something I didn't. So what's interesting is that, I've been painted as this criminal mastermind fraudster. My first trading job at UBS was what's called a give-ups trader. So I sat in the middle of a process where we designed this process where our clients could trade UK equities and other equities without paying any tax on the trades they did, right? And it was a very kind of laborious process, but it saved 0.5% on every single trade. So it was worth doing. My job was to sit in the middle of that and to help assist in the process of these organizations not paying their dues to their community. And if you stop and think about what that means to a young trader, what it means is that, like, you are day in, day out learning through intuition that it is acceptable to do things that go against the interests of your community, to do things that are ultimately ethically and morally wrong. But because that's what you do every day, you start to be not able to see what the moral and ethical pillars are. These are some of the challenges that financialization creates in our society, and some of the challenges that come from massively increasing the amount of debt that we use to inflate asset prices around the world. There's a great book, it's called Blind Spots. It's about ethics, and Bazerman and Tembursell basically state to the beginning of this book that the reason why we fail as a global society to control the ethical decision-making of our society is because actually most people don't know when they face an ethical dilemma. They don't know how to make a decision. And if you don't even recognize that you're facing an ethical dilemma, it's very hard to make the right choice. I'm not making excuses for what happened, but I'm trying to explain, because just 2 weeks ago, a trader in the States lost $350 million, got fired. 2 months ago, a trader in Singapore lost $650 million and got fired, and are being investigated for criminal action for doing exactly the same stuff as what we did at UBS. And the point is that these things are still happening. These things are still happening. Now, so I was a member of a team called the ETF Desk, and our job was to basically trade the bank's money to make profit for the bank. And this guy, Ozzy Grubel, joined the bank in 2009, and he asked us basically that we needed to take more risk. And The Economist at the time called it the gambling for redemption strategy. Now, we actually used the processes we developed, thinking that they were accepted practice because our managers knew about them, our accountants knew about them. By summer of 2011, we generated $132 million of profit for the bank. Because of a fight we had on the desk, we ended up losing. We called the market wrong. And because we'd been working so hard that year, we then basically suffered what I call decision fatigue, right? So we started to lose money and started to panic and not know to get out of the trade and basically double down. And the trade got worse and worse as the market fell 30 to 40%. We lost 2.3 billion. I took responsibility. I went to prison I got sentenced to 7 years, did 3.5, spent another 3.5 avoiding deportation. So basically, my freedom was absolutely restricted for 7 years. And finally, I got deported. Now, the thing about being deported, right, is the year of return. And I've been back in Ghana for 13 months. The thing about being deported was it was as traumatic as it was, the first time that I felt free. I felt free. And in this year of return, to all the diaspora around the world, come home. You will be free. The world is politicizing migration. This is a chart that shows you how often the UK Parliament talked about migration, and foreign national offenders especially. That spike is basically 25% of all the mentions of immigration and foreign national offenders in the UK Parliament was 3 months before the Brexit vote, because it allowed them to get the headlines of migration into the newspapers. Politicization of migration, funnily enough, coincides brilliantly with the year of return, right? The West is trying to shut its doors, pull up the drawbridge, build walls. We're trying to grow. We're trying to look forward. Our people need to come home. There's so much of this story to tell, and it's very, very difficult to tell it in a TED format in 15 minutes. But I leave you with one message. What is happening around the world today, the politicization of migration, the crisis of democracy, the way that social media is destroying the social conversation, is deeply aligned to the financialization of our society. The way that the financial policies we are using are making life more and more difficult for poor people is the reason why people are increasingly protesting around the world. So our desire to protect a system that is structurally flawed is causing social dislocation. We in Africa have an opportunity, and that opportunity is to recognize that the West is scrambling and it's looking for a way, it's looking for leadership, it's looking for a way to think about the world and to organize itself in a way that actually works. And the problem is that that is contradicting the power structures. And we in Africa have an opportunity, because we've got such a small middle class and a young population, to build a system that serves better everyone in our community. If we get that right, then we get it right within the values of Ubuntu and community and brotherhood and sisterhood. If we get that right, then we take our rightful place as leaders in the world, because we lead on a moral basis. And you build systems around that moral foundation, and guess what will happen? Even though right now all the financial leverage sits in the West, eventually we will be able to lead the way forward, because our values are different, right? Our values are different. Ultimately, what happened to TJ?
Bro, you've done so much work. Thank you so much. If it wasn't for the conversation that we had the other day, this would have never transpired, because we would have never known how to push the thing. And this morning when we came into the barristers thing, 8 minutes before the hearing's supposed to start, the guys haven't even received the statements. And it looked like typical one of those, this is how it's gonna get fucking bungled. But then we had a Chinese guy, and I was just like, this guy, Chinese barrister. And it's like this guy. And then he starts reading through the statements, and I start seeing, he starts shaking his head, and he's like, and I could just see this look on his face, like he was getting excited about this. And then the judge was like, what the fuck is this about? And then he said, I want a probation, an eval. And then the prosecution didn't ask for street dealing, but the judge said that it was street dealing. The prosecution didn't even ask for street dealing and said that he should have a short custodial sentence or a high-level community order. So even the prosecutor, she was a young black woman. And she gave me that look when I was sitting in the bench, and she gave Roman a look. And then she decided to relax. Man, it was just divine intervention, that's all I can say. And then after we came out, like, the barrister's like, you know what, I've been doing this job for 30-some years, and I don't really see this happening, so make sure you don't fuck it up. This doesn't happen. Most of the time, there's not even a conversation with this kind of case. Yeah, man. So, thank you very, very much, man. You've really done a huge amount and created a huge amount of value. And it's just nice that some of the pain that we've been through has found a really, really great place to create value. Thanks.
We have to help our people around the world. These young kids who are struggling for opportunity in the West, bring them home. We can look after them from here. Thank you very much.